Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 6 of this class. So I want to remind you that your first papers are due this week. I want them turned into a Turnitin link that I'll put on Banquet Hall probably today or tomorrow. I want them turned in by Sunday at midnight. So I've had a lot of good discussions with people about their papers so far. If you're at all worried and haven't talked with me yet, remember that Monday through Friday from 9 to 10 I have Zoom office hours at the link listed in your syllabus and at the top of the Banquet Hall page. All you have to do if you haven't done so yet is click on it and we'll start talking, provided it's between the hours of 9 and 10. So this week, I think it's fitting that we're dealing with Columbus, especially since we don't have that as a holiday this year. Within the SUNY system, we actually voted a couple years ago to change the name of the holiday from Columbus Day to Indigenous Appreciation Day. Similarly, in my presentation for this week, I don't want to just talk about Columbus, but want to spend some time on Indigenous Americans as well. So for the introductory slide, though, I've got a picture of a statue of Columbus in Lisbon, where he sailed home. So the slide you're looking at here is one you've seen before, and we used this slide at the very beginning of the semester, and it shows one of the reasons why Columbus made his journey to begin with. So despite all of the eruptions destroying the archaic trade system that we started with in this semester, by 1492 the overall direction of trade was still much the same as it had been centuries earlier. Trade systems in the world, as it existed before most people knew about the Americas, were centered around the Middle East. The silks, porcelains, and spices of Asia were a hot commodity in Europe. The artwork, gold, and people of Africa were desired in the Middle East, while the people of Eastern Europe and wools, wines, honey, and furs from all of Europe helped pay for things from the rest of the world. So since all of this trade was centered on the Middle East and people there charged significant markups for the trade items that they controlled, there was a significant desire on the part of Europeans to get around the essential monopoly of these various empires. So especially as things like spices became more and more desired by Europeans, people had serious profit motive to circumvent the Middle East. Christopher Columbus was an innovative explorer who figured he could sail around the world the other way and get to the good stuff in India. And as you know, he didn't get to India, but found an entirely new continent. Oh, I gotta get my face out of the way here. Let's zoom it over here. Here, I'll put myself over Columbus since we saw his statue on the previous slide. Okay, so the point of this next slide is just to emphasize that Columbus wasn't alone. There were so many explorers, many of whom you've heard of before, others you might not have. So I'm skipping over the more commonly known explorers of the age of exploration to look at some lesser known people whose motivations were similar to those of Columbus, really to make the point that there's a period of global exploration frenzy that it was driven by a desire to dominate these amazing new trade opportunities that were beginning to open up. So on the left here, I've got Timofeyevich, who was a Cossack explorer who got a contract with a Russian fur trading company to explore Siberia. At the same time that English fur traders, Russia's best customers, were beginning to look towards North America instead of Russia. The Russians needed more trade goods to keep their European customers, so Timofeyevich made it all the way to the Pacific Ocean, claimed it for Russia, and succeeded in setting up what would be an infrastructure for Russia to become the biggest country in the world, really to compete with the explorers of North America. So over in China, 60 years before Columbus left on his journey, a man named Zhang He convinced the emperor to build a treasure fleet with ships more than 10 times as large as Columbus's to set up trade relations with the Indian Ocean. He made 2 voyages. On the second, he brought back a giraffe and paraded it through Beijing as a present for the emperor. There were Chinese people who thought that was really cool, and others who found it to be a colossal waste of money. Ultimately, the emperor decided such things were a waste of money, and they sunk Zhang He's ships to the bottom of the sea. Heard many people speculate that had China kept the ships, maybe they would have been the ones to discover the New World first, but they decided trade was a waste and that they should instead focus on their own production. And it was the early Ming Dynasty China that built the version of the Great Wall of China that we're all familiar with today. So then on the right here, I of course have Christopher Columbus, who was a Genoese explorer who got funding. Sorry, I had a little typo there. Fix it. So, ultimately it was Columbus's journey that brought the hemispheres together, not that he was the first and You've got Leif Erikson, possibly others, but Columbus was the one who actually made a difference. So I want to spend just a little bit of time looking at the areas of the world from which explorers didn't discover America. It's a nice way to tie together the themes we've been covering so far in this class. So let's jump back to China. The Ming Dynasty arose in the 1300s in response to Mongol rule of China. The Mongols, you've seen this slide before too, I'm just reviewing some things, were foreigners who arguably caused China and much of Asia to thrive through revitalizing ancient trade routes like the Silk Roads. But the Mongols had a hard time keeping control in the aftermath of the Black Plague, so after a period of instability, the Mongol dynasty arose. Sorry, not the Mongol, the Ming dynasty. Ming. Well, in its early years, the empire sponsored adventurers like the amazing, incredible Zhang He, who actually was contemporaneous with European explorers like Henry the Navigator. That all changed, as I just mentioned. It wasn't just trade that they disdained, though. Ultimately, with the transformations of the Ming Dynasty, there was a period when they disdained foreigners in general. But despite their initial insularity, with time the Ming grew tied into global trade more than ever before. Silver coming from the New World across Asian and oceanic trade routes, Atlantic trade routes, eventually devalued their currency to the point that they too became unstable. And after a period of instability in 1644, Manchus, a non-Han Chinese ethnic group, established the Qing dynasty. So let's jump over to Russia. We last dealt with Russia when covering the collapse of Kiev Rus with the murderous Mongol invasions in the 1230s and 1240s. For the next almost 200 years, the Mongols ruled Russia by giving all governing privileges to local nobility called Bayars, provided the Bayars would pay a steep yearly tribute. It was a rather light governing strategy that empowered those Russians who could best negotiate with the Mongols each year. So over the next 100 years, though, those Russians who cooperated with the Mongols began to mimic them, even calling themselves things like Hans. By the 1330s, one Ivan I conquered Moscow, exacting tribute from the people there in resistance to the Mongols. Over the next century, Moscow, rather than Kiev, became the new center of Russian power. In 1476, Ivan III would throw off Mongol control, famously tearing up their yearly demand for tribute, and unify Russian lands under his power. Over the next century, Russians struggled to establish a government that was something more than what the Mongols had. Yet, and remember this is the Golden Horde that ruled Russia, yet like the Mongols, they conquered across Asia and demanded yearly tribute from those they conquered, offering no other services than protection, much like a mafia racket. Ivan III's grandson, Ivan IV, or Ivan the Terrible, Grozny in Russian means both great and terrible. Much like the word terrible used to imply greatness in English as well. So Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Great, Ivan the Terrible, established many of the structures of Russia's monarchical power. To do this, though, involved terrible brutality. One night, in a fit of rage, he killed his son, who was to be his heir, leaving only his mentally disabled son for the throne after his death. One of the more notorious things he did, too, was attack the neighboring city of Novgorod to make sure that they would show subservience to him, and brutally murdered people, murdered priests who he saw to be his biggest resistors, in just a disgusting example of mafioso-like violence. So, this type of strong control wasn't necessarily what Russians needed. So for 4 years after Ivan the Terrible died, a regent named Boris Godunov, pictured on this slide down underneath Timofeyevich, reigned in his stead. And when Godunov became Tsar in 1598, people in Russia rebelled, and Russia had a civil war for 12 years. It's called the Time of Troubles. So during this period, the powerful Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth attempted to take over Russia, but failed. In 1612, Mikhail Romanov became Tsar, and the Romanovs would remain Tsars of Russia until 1917. It was under the Romanovs that Russia established a rigid system of serfdom, at about the time places in Europe were beginning to give up on it. So it's a lot in 2 paragraphs, so we'll come back to Russia later. So Of the three regions of the world that I just covered, they all might be considered gunpowder empires, with the caveat that Russia and China aren't usually categorized as such. But gunpowder empires is a term used in Middle Eastern history, and it's sometimes they're also called Islamic empires, which is why Russia and the Ming Dynasty don't fit. And they're so called because they monopolized the power structures needed to control gunpowder, which was a huge deal with 1400s technology. I mean, I doubt any of us could go out in the woods and come back with a functional gun that we smelted with fires. So if you were able to control that infrastructure, you had power. These gunpowder empires were governments based on powerful, expanding militaries whose governing actual day-to-day work was left to loyal governors and provinces who owed their positions to the emperor. But one of the things is if you had the power to control gunpowder, that power was kind of hard to resist because you had guns, and here you've got a gigantic cannon that the Mughals in India built, and it's on display in Delhi, Delhi. So eventually, with these gunpowder empires, their descendants, the descendants of these regional governors, would get comfortable in their regions and start to act independently in the center, thereby weakening the gunpowder empire in competition with tightly structured, well-funded European states. This is something we'll come to later in the semester. So empires that were key in this period, besides Russia and the Ming, were the Greek dominion of Tamerlane in Central Asia, its spin-off, the Mughal Empire of India, the Safavids of Persia, the Ottomans of the Middle East and southeastern Europe. Those five. So Safavids, Ottomans, the Mughals, Ming Dynasty, Russia really make up the important gunpowder empires in this transition period before the dominance of European powers, Western European powers. So this next slide is my way to illustrate what ultimately happened with the discovery of the Americas. The center of global trade shifted from the Middle East to the Atlantic Ocean, meaning the center of global wealth went from Middle Eastern empires and kingdoms to those Western European and eventually American countries that could dominate the trade of the Atlantic Ocean. That trade would eventually become criminally profitable through the use of slavery. We'll deal with slavery later in the semester, but for now I should mention that roughly 15 million people were sent across the Atlantic to the Americas. Perhaps 3 million died en route, and many more in the brutal plantation conditions of places like the Caribbean and eventually the American South as well. Brazil was also horrific. The other group that suffered from contact were Native Americans. The best estimates developed over the past just 40 years are that roughly 95% of the New World's population died within the first century of contact. The tens of millions of people who died primarily from diseases to which they had no immunity were rarely able to tell their stories. So much of what we know about pre-1492 Native Americans doesn't come from them because they weren't alive long enough to tell their stories. The plague, by comparison, was absolutely devastating to the Old World, where as high as 50% of some populations died. But when you get to the level of death that happened in the Americas, entire societies and ways of life disappeared. And again, 95% of the population in North and South America was gone within a century of contact. So once large civilizations became small, wandering bands of survivors. What's incredible is that so much of native culture survived the guns, germs, and steel of contact, as the author Jared Diamond titled his book 22 years ago. So I want to go over with broad brushstrokes a few of the areas of the New World. As understood from their own historical records, those who identify with these cultures today, and archaeological evidence. So we'll start with Mesoamerica. Broadly speaking, those pre-Columbian people in southern Mexico and Central America are referred to by archaeologists as Mesoamericans. It's Greek for Central Americans. They like the word because it sounds fancier than saying Central Americans. So over thousands of years, archaeologists, that is, it's an archaeological term. The people who lived in this area for thousands of years, though, starting with the San Lorenzo civilization, which periodized later as the Olmec, followed by the Mayans, um, had fascinating innovations. By the time of the Mayans, they had developed the ability to have perhaps the highest population density in the world, with lots of excess production necessary to build fabulous monumental architecture, temples, cities, and even to develop a writing system. One key of their civilization was the domestication of corn from a non-edible species called teosinte. Corn and potatoes, another New World crop, potatoes are from the Andes, produce more calories per acre than any other terrestrial crop. You can do more with aquaculture, which the Mesoamericans also did. So the groups I mentioned, ending with the Mayan, the Olmec Mayan, San Lorenzo civilization, they weren't the only Central Americans. A latecomer group were the Aztecs, and it's important to understand how unlike they were by Mayan speakers. The Aztecs were Uto-Aztecan speakers who came late to Central America, developed a massive city at Tenochtitlan, and took Mesoamerican practices of human sacrifice to a horrifying new level. So much so that on the next slide you'll see that when a certain conquistador left Cuba to find a famed city of gold, he managed to topple the entire Aztec Empire by marshaling the regional hatred people had for the Aztecs. Traditional explanations emphasize that it was Spanish gunpowder and the fact that they were seen as gods that toppled the Aztecs. Contemporary explanations emphasize that the Spanish had hundreds of thousands of native allies, Nahuatl-speaking people who were happy to have an ally against the Aztecs. Disease also played a disproportionately large role in the demise of the Aztecs. So in the area that would become the United States of America, an early people the Spanish came into contact with were part of a broad cultural region that we today call the Mound Builders, or Cahokia and Hopa civilizations. These ancestors of those who spoke modern-day Algonquin languages primarily range from the Mississippi River to the Appalachians and even into western New York. From excavating these sites, it's obvious that they had trade relations with people all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and importantly, Mesoamerica. The structure of their ceremonial mounds sometimes seems to almost mimic the stone architecture of Mesoamerica. While early Spanish explorers saw cities with thousands of people, these cultures literally died out by the time of widespread English and French contact. Farther to the west, you've got Puebloan civilizations and the Navajo, including both Uto-Aztecan and Athabascan languages that had common cultural practices as far north as Utah and Nevada and as far south as the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. So these people were decimated by European diseases in the 1500s. Uto-Aztecans were among the last great nomads, in the pre-horse term. Nomad is a somewhat difficult term. They only domesticated animals. They had their dogs and they ate them. But Uto-Aztecan speakers were mobile and they also farmed. And in the last 500 years before the Spanish arrived in the New World, they had expanded from Alaska all the way to Mexico. I worked on archaeological excavations of Uto-Aztecan peoples in Utah in 2003 and 2004, and we found some really interesting things. First of all, in the 1300s, the population density of southern Utah was about 10 times what it is today. When things were going well, we found lots of hunted meat like wild sheep, deer, buffalo, and even dogs in their bone piles. The climate was less desert-like 800 years ago, but it was still dry back then. Their main subsistence came from corn, which they would grow in valleys during the summertime, where they also hunted, fished, and gathered wild foods like sage, berries, juniper, and cactus. In the wintertime, they would move to cliff tops, where they stored their corn in granaries that were extremely difficult to get to on the side of cliffs. In both their summer and winter residences, they would build small cities. They made pottery, artwork, toys, a stylized form of rock art. They wove wool and juniper bark, made ropes and nets, and lived fairly good lives. By the end of the 1300s, the Navajo moved into the area where we were studying, and Anasazi and Fremont people moved farther south. Some, like the Fremont, would essentially become the Hopi, and others, like the Anasazi, became Puebloan, and may have even gone as far south to join with the Aztecs. So there's an archaeological site from the late 1300s where 70 skeletons had been reconstructed showing evidence of butchering and cooking, or cannibalism. By the early 1400s, many of their dwellings were located in the same cliff sides where they formerly overtook their grain. And one of the most amazing sites is Mesa Verde in Colorado, which is occupied for a really long time. We've got the Chaco Canyon site mentioned here too, which has seems to have some of the ball courts that you see in Mesoamerica. So the Navajo adopted many of the cultural practices of Puebloan people, but maintained a distinct language and culture. They are the largest Native American tribe in the United States today. There are quite a few Navajo who, unlike other tribes in the U.S., still speak Navajo as their first language. There are other tribes who do this as well. So Navajo are renowned for their pottery and weaving, and since Spanish contact, for their sheep herding skills. Today, most Navajo make their living from tourism, sheep, or mining and oil drilling. So before contact with the Spanish, they knew how to weave the wool, but it was wool taken from hunted wild sheep, not farm sheep. Navajo wool rugs today sell for thousands of dollars a piece. So farther south, another civilization that controlled vast amounts of territory and had trade relations all over South and Central America was the Inca. Sometime in the 1200s, the Inca began to organize cities and trade routes between the Andean Mountains and the Pacific Ocean in Peru. It's not a large territory, but between 1438 and 1533, they rapidly expanded their political control, covering much of the Andean mountain range. In 1438, they built their capital in Cusco, which in the Quechua tradition, the dominant native language in Peru, is spoken almost as frequently in the country as Spanish in rural areas. So Cusco, in their tradition, is the navel of the universe. It's a beautiful city built in the mountaintops of the Andes for defensive and cosmic purposes. They did not have a written language, but in order to administer their large empire, they developed an algorithmic system of record keeping that uses the same principles as modern-day computers. Kipu were ropes with knots tied into them that, when arranged and interpreted by an accountant, could tell important financial and economic information. They were also masters of surviving in high altitudes. They learned to grow things like potatoes and quinoa, which could survive cold weather and grow well in otherwise poor soils. In 1527, then, Francisco Pizarro came down from Mexico and made contact with the Inca. Having heard of their vast riches, he was right. Incans excelled at metalworking, and Pizarro was able to gain roomfuls of gold that he smelted, sometimes by holding people like Atahualpa as a hostage, the emperor of the Inca. So he was able to get roomfuls of gold that he smelted into coins, loaded onto ships, and sent back to Spain. In 1531, Pizarro came back to Peru and was able to conquer them with only 127 Spanish troops and about 10,000 native allies and disease. So part of the reason it was so easy is that the Spaniards had advanced tactical fighting that they learned in centuries of fighting Islamic powers in Spain. But disease had also ravaged the Incan Empire. They held on under Pizarro's control until the 1570s, when the Incan Empire was wholly absorbed into the Spanish colony of Peru. So, alright, I used an earlier version of PowerPoint because I was using a different computer to make these slides, and so the font is weirdly large, but I guess it's alright. So here are some bonus questions for you. That was a lot to tie together, both reasons for exploration and the consequences of being explored. Hope you have a good week, and good luck with your papers.